It is the early hours of June 5, 1944, somewhere in the gray swell of the English Channel. Aboard a tank landing craft pitching towards the coast of Normandy, a young engineer officer crouches beneath a canvas awning, torch clamped between his teeth, unfolding a sheet of paper that has been folded and refolded so many times the creases have gone soft as cloth. It is a map, printed only weeks earlier at a scale of 1 to 12,500, close enough to show individual hedgerows, individual farm tracks, individual houses along a beach the planners have code-named Omaha. Every man around him carries a version of the same sheet, printed under a code name that reveals nothing of what it actually is: Benson. None of them know that word refers to the greatest cartographic undertaking in human history, an effort that will, by the war's end, produce close to 1 billion maps between the Allied nations. None of them know the names of the soldiers, librarians, photographers, and printers working around the clock in obscure buildings from Washington to the English countryside to put this exact piece of paper in this exact hand at this exact moment. They only know that in a few hours they will step off a ramp into freezing water, and the difference between living and dying may come down to whether the paper in their pocket tells the truth about the ground ahead. This is the story of the men and women of America's Wartime Mapping Corps, an organization so unglamorous it barely earns a footnote in most histories of the Second World War, and so essential that without it, the war could not have been fought the way it was fought at all. It has no famous weapon, no dramatic silhouette, no roar of engines. Its currency was ink, paper, and precision. And yet it shaped the outcome of Overlord, of the Italian campaign, of the drive across France and into Germany, as surely as any tank or aircraft. This is the story of why that mattered, and why it has been so thoroughly forgotten. To understand why an army needed its own mapping corps, you first have to understand what American forces actually had going into the war. In 1939, the United States Army's capacity to produce topographic maps of foreign territory was, in the bluntest terms, negligible. The organization responsible, a small outfit known as the Engineer Reproduction Plant, had spent the interwar years handling the intermittent, low-pressure mapping needs of a peacetime army that rarely fought anywhere its own soldiers had not already surveyed by hand. It was a unit of lithographers and technicians, competent but tiny, entirely unprepared for a war that would eventually require accurate, detailed, constantly updated maps of nearly every corner of the earth. The beaches of North Africa, the mountains of Italy, the bocage of Normandy, the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. The scale of the problem becomes clearer when you consider what commanders were actually working with in the early years. There is a story, often repeated by veterans of the North African campaign, that General George S. Patton planned elements of Third Army's movements using little more than a civilian Michelin roadmap of Europe, his own memory of terrain, and an instinct that armor could cross ground that had carried invading forces since the days of William the Conqueror. Whether or not every detail of that account is precise, it captures something true and alarming. Senior American commanders were, in the first years of the war, working with a patchwork of civilian tourist maps, outdated colonial surveys, and whatever fragments of foreign cartography could be scavenged, purchased, or stolen. Roads that no longer existed, bridges that had been demolished years before, villages renamed, rivers rerouted, contours guessed at rather than measured. An army moving on maps like these was, in a very real sense, moving half-blind. The stakes of that blindness were not abstract. A commander who does not know the gradient of a hillside cannot know whether his tanks can climb it. A planner who does not know the load limits of a bridge cannot know whether his artillery can cross it without collapsing the structure into the river beneath. A landing force that does not know the composition of a beach, whether it is firm sand or soft clay that will swallow a vehicle to its axles, cannot know whether its assault will succeed or drown in the surf. Every one of these questions, multiplied across thousands of miles of coastline, hundreds of river crossings, and an eventual advance through the most fought-over terrain in Europe, added up to an operational crisis that no amount of manpower or firepower could solve on its own. America was about to fight a war of movement across continents it had never systematically surveyed, using an agency built to handle peacetime requests for the occasional training exercise. Something had to change, and it had to change quickly. The answer arrived in 1942, with the creation of the Army Map Service, formed by folding the old engineer reproduction plant together with the library and cartographic section of the War Department General Staff. It was headquartered in the Washington area, under the Army Corps of Engineers, and its mandate was staggering in scope. Compile, produce, and distribute every topographic map the armed forces of the United States would need, anywhere in the world, at whatever scale operations demanded, on a timetable set by the pace of the war itself. Within a remarkably short time, the organization was reportedly operating around the clock, 6 days a week, its presses never fully silent. The technical challenge facing the Army Map Service and the field topographic battalions that worked alongside it was not simply drawing lines on paper. It was building an entirely new information pipeline, one that converted raw aerial photography into precise, readable, reproducible terrain intelligence at a pace no cartographic organization had ever attempted. The process began with reconnaissance aircraft flying meticulous overlapping passes above enemy and friendly territory alike, their cameras capturing thousands of vertical photographs designed to be viewed in pairs through a stereoscope, a simple optical device that tricks the eye into perceiving depth from two flat images taken from slightly different angles, in much the same way your two eyes let you judge distance. Skilled photogrammetrists, many of them trained on techniques pioneered after the First World War, would pore over these photograph pairs, translating shadows and textures into contour lines, roads, buildings, watercourses, and vegetation. A single square mile of contested ground might require dozens of individual photographs, cross-referenced against captured enemy survey data, pre-war civilian maps, and whatever intelligence reports could confirm or contradict what the camera showed. Once a map had been compiled, it moved to reproduction, a process closer to industrial printing than anything most people imagine when they picture a cartographer. Lithographic presses, the same fundamental technology used for newspapers and posters, stamped out maps by the tens of thousands, each sheet requiring multiple print runs to layer contour lines, symbols, place names, and color coding into a single legible document. The paper itself had to withstand rain, mud, sweat, and constant folding in a soldier's pocket, which meant experimentation with coatings and stock that could survive conditions no ordinary printed document was ever designed for. Distribution then became its own logistical operation, moving finished maps from presses in the United States and in forward printing units in Britain out to divisions, regiments, and even individual platoons, often with only days or hours to spare before an operation began. For the Normandy landings alone, planners required something close to 70 million individual map sheets, an almost unimaginable figure for a single operation, covering everything from strategic overviews for Army Group commanders down to beach obstacle diagrams intended for the engineers who would have to clear them under fire. Some of these sheets, especially those depicting the immediate landing zones, carried a code name precisely because their content was so sensitive. Revealing the scale and detail of Allied mapping of a specific beach would have told German intelligence, with near certainty, exactly where the invasion was coming. The map, in other words, had become as classified and as strategically vital as the invasion plan itself, because in a real sense, it was the invasion plan. The people producing this material were, for the most part, ordinary Americans thrust into extraordinary and thankless work. Civilian librarians and academics found themselves drafted into cartographic intelligence, tasked with tracking down foreign publications, out-of-print atlases, and captured enemy documents that might reveal a crucial detail about terrain no aerial photograph could capture, such as the load capacity of a rural bridge or the seasonal flooding pattern of a river valley. Field topographic battalions, Small units of surveyors and draftsmen attached to army groups advancing across France and into Germany worked within earshot of the front lines, updating maps in near real time as roads were destroyed, bridges blown, and villages reduced to rubble unrecognizable from the aerial photographs taken only weeks before. Their work was rarely dramatic to watch. A man hunched over a drafting table by lamplight, correcting a contour line, does not make for cinematic footage, but multiply that unglamorous labor across thousands of individuals, sustained for years without pause, and you begin to understand how an army that started the war navigating by tourist maps ended it able to plan operations down to the level of individual farm buildings. The maps did not stop being useful once the landing craft reached the sand. If anything, the demand for fresh, accurate terrain intelligence grew heavier as the campaign moved inland, because the ground itself kept changing. In the weeks after the Normandy landings, field topographic units attached to advancing American armies found themselves working almost literally on the heels of the infantry, updating sheets to reflect blown bridges, flooded fields deliberately opened by retreating German engineers, and roads cratered beyond recognition from the aerial photographs taken only a fortnight earlier. During the Italian campaign, where narrow mountain roads and demolished river crossings could stall an entire division for days, accurate large-scale mapping of gradients and bridge capacities became the difference between an armored column moving forward on schedule and one sitting immobile under artillery fire while engineers searched for an alternative route. The same intelligence chain that produced beach obstacle diagrams for Omaha and Utah also produced river crossing studies for the Rhine, hydrographic profiles noting current speed, bank composition, and likely fording points long before the first assault boats were launched. It would be dishonest to claim the system was infallible. The most sobering evidence of its limits came in December 1944 in the Ardennes. Situation maps compiled by Allied intelligence staff in the days before the German offensive show the forest sector opposite American lines recorded as largely empty of enemy formations, a serious and consequential failure, though one rooted chiefly in the interpretation of available intelligence rather than in any flaw in the terrain mapping itself. The ground was drawn correctly. What moved across it was missed. That distinction matters, because it captures something true about the entire mapping effort. It could tell commanders with remarkable precision what the Earth looked like, but it could never by itself tell them what the enemy intended to do with it. As the battle developed and reconnaissance improved, previously unlocated German units began appearing on the daily situation sheets, a small, granular illustration of how quickly the picture could sharpen once fresh photography and field reports caught up with reality on the ground. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a tap. It is worth pausing here to compare America's mapping effort with what its allies and its enemies were doing at the same time, because the contrast sharpens exactly what made the American achievement so significant. Britain's own military mapping organization, the War Office's geographical section of the General Staff, had a considerable head start, having maintained active foreign survey work through much of the interwar period as part of running a global empire. British and American cartographers ultimately worked in close, often overlapping cooperation, sharing photography, base surveys, and printing capacity, and the Normandy mapping effort itself was very much a joint undertaking rather than a purely American one. Where the American contribution proved decisive was in sheer industrial capacity, the ability to scale printing and photogrammetric analysis to match the enormous material resources the United States was pouring into the European theater, producing finished sheets at a volume that outstripped what a smaller, longer-established British organization could manage alone. German mapping, by contrast, tended to be excellent in its core European territories, built on decades of meticulous pre-war civilian surveying, but grew steadily weaker the further the war carried German forces from home ground, and increasingly starved of the fuel, aircraft, and printing capacity needed to keep aerial reconnaissance and reproduction running at pace once Allied air superiority took hold over Western Europe from 1944 onward. There is a certain irony in the fact that the very German maps produced to support a war of conquest, detailed surveys of resources and terrain across occupied Poland, the Baltic states, and the Soviet borderlands, became, once seized by advancing American and British forces, some of the most valuable cartographic material the Allies possessed. Small, unglamorous teams of American librarians, archivists, and intelligence officers followed just behind the front lines specifically to locate and secure these captured collections before retreating German units could destroy them, working alongside the same organizational apparatus that had built the Army Map Service in the first place. That captured material would go on to underpin American strategic mapping through the opening years of the Cold War, when much of Eastern Europe was otherwise closed to Western reconnaissance, and it was only by the mid-1950s that the Army Map Service began transferring these German-origin maps out to research libraries across the United States, where many collections remain today. The map, once again, outlived the war that had demanded its creation, and outlived, too, the regime that had originally ordered it drawn. Assessing the precise operational impact of this effort is not straightforward, and honesty demands acknowledging where the record runs thin. Casualty figures do not exist for lives saved by an accurate beach obstacle diagram or a correctly marked river ford. What survives instead is circumstantial but persuasive. After-action reports from engineer units praising the accuracy of terrain intelligence during the breakout from Normandy, commanders' memoirs crediting detailed mapping with allowing rapid armored advances across unfamiliar ground, and the simple institutional fact that demand for AMS products only grew as the war progressed, rather than diminishing as commanders learned to distrust what they were handed. What can be said with confidence is that the psychological effect on planning staff, the confidence that came from working with current, detailed, reliable terrain intelligence rather than a pre-war civilian atlas, was itself a form of force multiplication, allowing operations to be planned with a precision that would otherwise have been impossible. The legacy of this wartime mapping effort reached far beyond 1945. The organizational lessons learned about integrating aerial photography with rapid mass production, about coordinating field survey units directly with combat formations, became the template for military cartography through the Cold War and beyond, eventually evolving through several successor agencies into today's National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Surviving examples of the wartime maps themselves, including original sheets from the Normandy landings and captured German cartography seized during the advance across Europe, are preserved today in institutions such as the United States National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and the Library of Congress's Geography and Map Division in Washington, alongside university collections that have digitized tens of thousands of individual sheets for public research. If you know where to look, you can still trace the exact contour lines that guided a landing craft towards a beach in Normandy more than 80 years ago. Return, for a moment, to that landing craft in the dark, to the officer with the torch between his teeth and the soft, worn creases in his map. He has no idea of the scale of what put that paper in his hand. The librarians tracking down decades-old French cadastral surveys, the photogrammetrists squinting through stereoscopes at grainy aerial photographs, the printers running lithographic presses through the night, the field surveyors who would, within days, be updating this very sheet under fire as roads changed and bridges fell. He knows only that the paper is accurate, or he trusts that it is, and that trust is itself the product of an industrial and intellectual effort as vast, in its way, as the production of the tanks and aircraft that will follow him ashore. There was no medal for the man who corrected a contour line at 3 a.m. There was no memorial built for the woman who traced a river's true course from a captured German survey. Their names do not appear on the rolls of famous units. Their work does not feature in the popular telling of the war, and their instruments, drafting tables, stereoscopes, and lithographic stones, gathered dust in archives rather than museums built for public wonder. And yet nearly 1 billion pieces of paper crossed the Atlantic and the Channel because of them, each one a small, precise act of translation between the chaos of a continent at war and the certainty a soldier needed to survive the next few hours. They did not fire a shot. They did not storm a beach. But they told the men who did exactly what ground lay ahead, and in a war decided as much by preparation as by courage, that was its own kind of victory. The map got there first. Everything else followed the line it drew.